Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jeanette and I'm a high vibrational being. I wanted to start this video. I always like to incorporate my ancient ancestors, whether I'm going to do the Egyptians, and I'm using the book and Tutankhamun and the Golden Age of the Pharaohs, which is this book. Okay, I brought this book in the street, and I was very fascinated. I follow I used to follow the author of this book because I believe he's part of Gaia TV, and I seen a lot of his excursions, findings of Egyptian treasures. So I'm going to read a section of this book, which is called Religion Before Tutankhamun. Religion in ancient Egypt was more than a belief system. It was a way of life, permeating every aspect of existence. The fundamental practical governing this system was Mayat, an abstract concept often related as truth or justice, but more accurately defined as the way the world was supposed to be. Mayat was set in a place by the Creator God, the moment of creation, and renewed daily by the drawings of the sun. Within the created universe, every individual had his or her ordained place and function. According to this worldwide, the gods and the blessed dead had a direct effect on events in the world of the living. And the living had to provide constant attention to keep the many deities and spirits that hovered just beyond the earthly realm cared for and pacified. The daily details of the systems and its attendant beings developed slowly over time but remained fundamentally stable for millennia. In the late 18th dynasty, the radical theological innovations of Amenhotep IV Akhenaten undermined the status quo and set up repercussions that echoed to the ends of the Pharaonic era. In order to understand the effect of this revolution of the world of Egypt and its consequences for the life and times of Tutankhamun, who lived in its aftermath, it's important to first understand the nature of the traditional religion that defined and shaped the Egyptian world. Traditional religion. The first inhabitants of prehistoric Egypt, like other people of that era, were highly attuned to their environment. At some point, they began to ask themselves how the world had come into being and who controlled the forces of nature and dominated their lives. They began to imagine hidden beings that inhabited a realm beyond the earth and directed these mystery powers. They anthropomorphized these beings, gave them names, and assigned them characteristics of the wild animals and shared their lands. The stable environment of Egypt and its regular agricultural seasons, bonded by the annual flooding of the Nile, lay at foundations of its religion systems. The yearly cycle of inundations gave rise to the myth of creation, in which a primordial mount rose from limitless darkness and waters, providing a platform for which the Creator God could stand to work his magic. The sun, with its regular and unchanging cycles, was the most prominent feature of natural world. It rose every day, bringing light and life to the earth, and disappears every night, leaving the world in darkness. It was visible. It was the it was the visible expression of the daily cycles of creation, symbolically dying as it sets on the western horizon and being reborn as it rose in the east, thus reenacting the moment when the universe first came into being. I always want to stop my throat chakra. By by the Pharaonic era, the Egyptian pantheon was composed of many gods and goddesses. These were represented in art as human animals or a combination of the two. Each was linked to one or more towns and identified by specific characteristics. For example, the principal god of Memphis was Ptah, patron of artisans. He was worshipped there with his consort, Sekhmet, goddess of war, and their son, Nefertum. In Abydos, the chief god of Osiris, king of the dead, venerated with his sister Isis and their child Horus. Other than the creator, who could be identified with a variety of local deities, the most important member of the Egyptian pantheon was the sun god, Re, R-E. This god was originally portrayed as a boatman who rowed across the marshes of creation. By the early historic era, Re had begun to adopt their forms, most often of a falcon-headed man. His principal cult site was Heliopolis in the Mephrodite region. His worship there was associated with sacred Benin stones, represented in art as a pyramid or squat obelisk. This stone was identified with the rays of the sun streaming down to earth and became a key solar symbol. At Idfu, the sun god was imaged in the form of a hawk soaring across the sky and was linked with the celestial god Horus. As Horus of the two horizons, the god was portrayed as a human with a hawk head topped with disk of the sun. Surrounding this disk was a snake, identified as the serpent of creation and imagined as a symbol of the realm through which the sun god passed each night. The sun god had two barks, one for day called Matgit, and the other at night, Mesket. At noon he was Re, a man with a sun disk on his head. With the setting sun he became the Heliopolitan creator god. Atum, as an old man, at night he traveled through the Netherlands to be united with Osiris, god of the dead. At dawn he was reborn either as a scrap beetle, Capri, which is also the hieroglyphic sign for create or come into being, or as the child, Nefertum, rising from a lotus. Each major god or group of gods was worshipped in one or more temples, where the spirits were housed with cult images made of precious materials. These temples were monumental feats of agriculture and engineering, requiring mass quantities of stones and the skills of thousands of workers. After the king and his architects chose a site and planned their project, they consecrated the area with a foundation ceremony in which 10 separate rituals were performed. The most important of these was the stretching of the cord, where the king laid out the temple ground plan. In another part of the ceremony, pottery, vessels, building tools, baskets, food offerings, and plaques bearing the names of the kings were ritually buried at their corners of the plant structure. Once work began, tons of limestones and sandstones for the temple core were quarried and transported to the site, along with the finer limestones needed for the relief that would adorn the structures, and the calcite, granite, coniferous wood imported from Lebanon, and other expensive items for specific purposes. Workers at the site mixed huge amounts of mud and sands for bricks. Tools and equipment were needed, as well as unfold qualities of food to keep the artisans and stone haulers healthy and productive. Building techniques developed over thousands of years were generally simple but effective. For example, to make the massive columns needed for pillars, halls, and courts, rounded slabs were set one atop the other, then finished with decorated in place. After the basic temple was completed, future kings often made their own additions and modifications to the work of their predecessors. Properly built temples, their walls and obsolete, carved with appropriate scenes and texts, were essential to the constant continuance of the Egyptian world. They function, in fact, as miniature models of the universe. The rituals performed within their sacred space served magically to reenact the creation of the world and thus ensure its perpetual survival. It is not surprising that such vast resources were devoted to the construction, decorations, and maintenance of these magnificent structures. By the New Kingdom, most state temples followed by the same basic plan. Each divine precinct was founded by a plyon, a massive gateway that echoed the hieroglyph for horizon. Before the plyon stood up obsolete, narrow, pointed spires sacred to the sun that soared to the sky. An enclosed wall delimited the rest of the temple precinct and the holy areas within. The outer surfaces of the temple were dedicated to images of the king triumphing over his enemies, symbolically protecting the temple from the forces of chaos. The agricultural of the temple within the design to mirror the landscape of the cosmos. At the moment of creation, closest to the plyon were colonnaded courtyards and pillared halls representing the primeval swamp of creation, their ceilings held up by columns, the forms of marsh plants such as papyrus and lotus. Beyond the last pillared hall was an innermost shrine where the divine image was housed, washed, clothed, fed, and otherwise vivified and pacified. Its floor's level was higher than that of another outer halls, reinforcing its identification with the primordial mound. In the context of his or home temple, each deity acted as a creator god. Each day, as light entered the shrine, also conceived as heaven, the moment of creation was reenacted. Additional rooms in the inner parts of the temple could serve as shrines to house the divine boat, used to carry the gods in festival processions or as dwelling for associated deities. The walls of the state temple were carved with scenes focusing on the relationships between king and god, especially depictions of the rites and rituals that were to be carried out within the sacred spaces. The Egyptians believed in the magical power of word and image by illustrating their myths. They made them real and representing the cult. They ensured that its ritual would be performed magically for eternity, even if priests were no longer available. Other decorative elements emphasize the identification of temple with cosmos. For example, the traditional access for a temple was east-west winged. Sun discs were often carved on lintels of the doorways that led along the access, mirroring the daily paths of the sun. Some call it myths. I have my own beliefs, so I don't see it as a myth. I don't see their stories as a myth. I see there's some truth. I see there's a lot of truth to the Egyptian writing, hieroglyphic messages that was left behind. And they knew that one day those messages would be interpreted with the truth. The colossal statues and the obelisk of Ramses II mark the Ramesside plans of Luxor Temple in Atum. This is, I don't know if you can see it. I don't know how you can see it, but it's a beautiful. I feel like I'm reading for a class. Wow. How much? Okay. Egyptians monarchs were considered semi-divine, and their rules were inextricably strict. Mercury retrograde. Sorry, I can't pronounce this word, and I don't know what's going on with my throat, but intertwined with the gods whom they worship. The kings were both temporal and spiritual leaders of Egypt. The link between the earthly and the celestial realms. From the earliest periods of Egypt's history, he was considered an embodiment of the sky god Horus on earth, and was responsible for the establishment and maintenance of Mayat, ally of the gods and their representative of in the world of mankind. He stood against the powers of chaos, primeval darkness and water, represented on earth by wild animals and foreign enemies. They constantly surrounded and threatened the ordered world. As an intermediary between humans and gods, he was, at least in theory, high priest in every temple, although in actuality the king's role was delegated to priests in temple art. It is always the king who is shown performing the cult rituals and thus caring for the gods and goddesses who dwell therein. Religion in early 18th dynasty. In the New Kingdom, the god Amun took center stage. First mentioned in the period text of the Old Kingdom, Amun was originally one of the 8 principal gods of Ashem, Ashamun. I don't know how to pronounce Ashimuin, a site in Middle Egypt, with his consort Amunet. Amun, the hidden one, was chief against these gods, representing the unseen power of the cosmos. He is often depicted in human form wearing a knee-length kilt, a long curled beard, and a leathered crown topped by 2 long plumes. His sacred animals were the ram and the goose. With the rise of the Taliban 18th dynasty, Amun became the chief god of the state, credited with sponsoring the great military victories of the kings. Synchronized with Re, he became Amun-Re, the new king of the gods. For the king of the early 18th dynasty, Amun-Re was the first among the creator gods. The creation myth in which people played the central role was linked with the Heliopolitan creation story. He was identified with Atum, Lord of Heliopolis. Well, I could say that, not Heliopolitan. Okay. Amun was also associated with other important gods such as Min and Ithyphallic, fertility, god worship at Akhim, and Kahun, a ram-headed god from Elephantine. Much of the tribute and booty that the monarch of the 18th dynasty brought back from their wars abroad went to fill the coffers of Amun as gifts of gratitude. In addition to his principal cult center of Karnak, monuments to this god were built throughout Egypt and Nubia. As the importance of Atum and the wealth of the god's temple increased, so did the power and the influence of his priesthood. But at least in the middle of the 18th dynasty, the right to rule was dependent on Amun. Several kings were proud to proclaim their election to the throne through the oracle of Amun, and both Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III underlined their legitimacy by commissioning scenes that portrayed them as the offspring of the human queen and the god. The center of Amun's Theban cult was the East Bank at a site known by the Arabic name Karnak. To the Egyptians, it was Apsu. It is documented. Building history goes back to the Middle Kingdom. It is likely that the earlier kings had erected monuments here, but these have not survived by standing monuments. The core of the sprawling precinct, which spans about 62 acres, was dedicated to Amun himself, with subsidiary temples and shrines for his Theban consort, Mut, their son Khonsu, and the gods of war Montu. Every king of the 18th dynasty added his or her mark to this complex in the form of plioned rune shrines, pillared halls, and obelisk. 2 axes ran through the temple. The principal axis was east to west, facing the river, and second axis ran from the north to south, where the avenues of the Sphinx connected the temples of Kashu and Luxor Temple. Luxor Temple lay 2 miles to the south and was called Atep Resort, the southern sanctuary. Like Karnak, the temple was dedicated to Amun, Mat, and Sahu. The earliest remains dated to the end of the Middle Kingdom. Ahuz is said to have built at Luxor, but the first preserved agriculture featured from the New Kingdom a small chapel that is now part of a series of bark shrines, and Taban triads dates to the reign of Hatshepsut. This was apparently one of the 6 such chapels built for the use of Amun and his family during the Opet festival, a yearly reenactment of the coronation during which the king traveled from Luxor to receive the powers and regalia of kingship of Amun. This is Amun. And he is of dark color. He is of dark color. He is not of any other color. Amenhotep III significantly built and expanded the Luxor Temple, adding among other things a court pillar and a shrine, now replaced by the bark shrine of Alexander the Great. How would they take Amuntek and replace it? This is, you see, I had no idea this took place. And a rebirth room carved with scenes of the king's divine conception from coupling his mother and Amun. However, the current entrance to this monument, including colossal statues, obsolete pylons, and first court date to the 19th dynasty, King Ramses II. Let's see. We got 10 minutes. Luxor's principal axis runs from north to south, but it rears portion dedicated to a form of Amun known as Amun-Apet is orientated east-west in line with the Amun Temple on the west bank of Meret Habu. This West Bank temple was imaged by the ancients to have been built on the Theban Mount of Creation, a house its own image of the god in its form of Amun, Ka-Mutef, Amun, bull of his mother, and Ithi-Phallic, creator god, who impregnated his own mother and was closely associated with the king, who was both an individual and an incarnation of his own father. Also dedicated to the worship of Amun of the West Bank, the realm of the setting sun and the lands of the dead, where the bark chapels and other shrines used during the Feast of the Valley, celebrated in the 10th month of the year. This festival, and an occasion for families to visit the temple of their beloved one, was associated with the great goddess Hathor of the West, protector of the realm of the dead. Worshippers carried the divine images of Amun, Mut, and Kashu across the Nile to the Bay of Cliff to Deir el-Bahari, where the principal sanctuary of the goddess Hathor was located. Although the king of the gods, Amun, Amun-Re was not the only important divinity in the 18th dynasty. For example, additions were made to the temple of Ptah at Memphis, to the cult places of Amun and Re at the Heliopolis. Adonis remained a major center of worship for the great monetary god Osiris, while the fertility god Men had a cult center at Hakim. Another significant deity were Horus, Hakum, Matu, Neith, Thoth, and Sebek. Many purely local gods and household geniuses, such as Toret and Bes, had active cults as well. Another important religious trend was the growth of henotheism, in which each of various gods began to be seen as aspects of central, universal deities. This development was both usurped and interrupted by the Amarna interlude, but it re-emerged, forged the fire of Akhenaten's radical views after the controversial king's death. Wow. These names are really strong. At the root of Akhenaten's religion revolutions, with its exclusive focus on the cult of the sun in the form of the solar orb, the Aten can be traced to the reigns of his immediate predecessors. The re-emergence of the northern sun cult began during the rule of Amenhotep II, who built a temple for the great sphinx at Giza as the sun god Hor-Mahet, building on the example of his father Thutmose IV, gave the cult of the northern sun the great prominence. This king appears in the Sphinx temple of Giza as the deified son of the god. The sun god, his father, was then identified with Hor-Mahet. Over evidence suggested that Thutmose IV may have elevated himself to divine status in his lifetime. For example, his later sanctuary shows him with almond eyes that lend his face an eerie, unearthly quality that may be associated with the cultic change. The shift in royal dogma may be due to the number of factors. Some scholars believe that the priesthood of the Amun was becoming too strong for the comfort of the royal house. The rise of the sun cult can be seen in part as an attempt to curb its power. Another factor may have been the growth of personal piety seen during the earlier parts of the dynasty. By becoming a god himself, Thutmose IV could bring cultic focus back to the royal house. The existence of the empire is another potential factor. By becoming one with the sun, always the most important Egyptian god, the king could watch over the Egyptian land from vantage point in the sky. The rise and importance of the orb of the sun may have also begun during the reign of Thutmose IV. A scribe from this period mentions the Aten, a word that in this context can be interpreted simply as a noun meaning sun disk or sun orb. This term first appeared in the pyramid text of the Old Kingdom. In texts of the early 18th dynasty, the word was used to mean throne or place of the sun. It is not until later part of the dynasty that the Aten was personified as a manifestation of the sun god himself. The origins of the symbol that became the icon for Arma, Amarna revolution, the solar orb with rays ending in hands reaching out to the earth, have been tentatively traced to an image of a stela Thymus IV erected in his father's temple at Giza, located at the top of the lunette. This shows a winged sun disk with his arms embracing the cartouche of the king. Another link to the later Armana material has been seen in Thymus IV. Thomasius IV's funerary figurines, which, like those of Akhenaten, bear only the king's name rather than the unusual magical spell. I only have 3 more minutes. The artistic cycle of this period begins to move into a more naturalistic mode, which culminates in exaggerated form during Akhenaten's reign. Thutmosis IV's son Amenhotep III paid great attention to the god Amun, who remained at the end of the Egyptian python during his reign. Son of a minor queen and married to a commoner, Amenhotep III right to the throne may have been called into question. He blustered his legitimacy by building great monuments to the king of the gods and emphasizing his own divine birth of offspring of this deity. However, during the 38th reign, the solar cult that had begun to flourish under Thutmosis IV also grew in importance. Some scholars believe that his son Thutmosis, who preceded him, and Amenhotep were trained by priests of Heliopolis, traditional center of cult of the sun god Re. Significant change occurred in the king's 30th year of the throne, and he celebrated his first Set festival. At this point, Amenhotep III became the living incarnation of various gods, including the gods of Memphis, Ptah, the sun god Re, and the creator god Atum. He was also identified as the orb sun Aten. One of the epithets was dazzling Aten, and his West Bank palace, the Thebes, was called the House of Dazzling Aten. Akhenaten, who came into the throne as Amenhotep IV, began his reign steeped into the intent of orthodoxy. A rock cult stela in the sandstone quarries at Gebel el Selasa shows him before Amun, although the image of God was later defaced. And the inscriptions of the third cataract in Nubia, he founded a new city to the god Amun, but he soon began to bring the new religion to prominence. By the 3rd year of his reign, the god had begun a series of temples dedicated to the solar cult Karnak, called the Aten for short, and god worship here was given an elaborated name, effectively synchronized several sons